Everyone knows Al Pacino's famous "hoo-ah" from Scent of a Woman, but when this veteran asked how he captured blindness so perfectly, Al Pacino confessed to an extreme method that almost broke his mind. The Tonight Show studio was alive with its signature Tuesday evening energy in Manhattan. The familiar blue and gold lighting created that warm, electric atmosphere that had made the show a late-night institution for decades. Al Pacino sat across from Jimmy Fallon, both engaged in what appeared to be a typical celebrity interview about his legendary career and iconic performances. The Roots had just finished their smooth musical transition, and the cameras were rolling hot. Jimmy's iconic curved desk gleamed under the professional studio lights, while the New York City skyline sparkled through the backdrop windows like a constellation of theatrical dreams and cinematic memories. Al looked every inch the acting legend he had become. At 84, he still possessed that intense magnetic presence and passionate energy that had captivated audiences for over 5 decades. Though now seasoned with the wisdom and depth that came from a lifetime of exploring the human condition through performance. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, with his silver hair neatly styled, he radiated the same authentic intensity that had made him one of cinema's most revered figures. "So, Al," Jimmy said, his animated gestures punctuating every word, "you've given us some of the most powerful performances in film history. Michael Corleone, Tony Montana, Frank Serpico, but I have to ask about Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade in Scent of a Woman. That Oscar win, that performance, it's absolutely incredible." Al's eyes lit up with that characteristic blend of passion and reflection. Frank Slade was a complex character, Jimmy. A man who had lost his sight, lost his purpose, but still had this fierce spirit, this refusal to give up on life completely. Playing him required me to understand not just blindness, but what it means to navigate the world when your primary sense is gone. The audience was clearly captivated by his intensity and insight, several older fans in the front rows nodding along with obvious admiration and respect. And that famous hoo-ah moment, Jimmy continued with a smile, has become part of American culture. Where did that come from? How did you develop Slade's unique personality? Al's expression became more thoughtful, more introspective. The hoo-ah was Slade's way of asserting himself, of reminding the world that he was still alive, still vital, even though he couldn't see. It came from understanding what it feels like to be invisible to society, to be written off because of a disability. The conversation was flowing naturally, touching on his preparation techniques, his collaboration with director Martin Brest, and how the role had challenged him to explore themes of dignity, purpose, and human resilience. The studio audience was completely engaged, hanging on every word from one of Hollywood's most passionate performers. "What's remarkable about that performance," Jimmy said warmly, "is how authentic it feels. Slade doesn't feel like someone acting blind. He feels like someone who has actually lived that experience. The way he moves, the way he uses his other senses, the way he interacts with the world, it's incredibly convincing." Al nodded, though there was something deeper in his eyes now, something that spoke of preparation that had gone far beyond traditional acting methods. "You know, Jimmy, when you're playing someone with a disability, you have a responsibility. You can't just pretend. You have to understand what that person's reality is really like." It was in this moment of reflection about authenticity and responsibility that a voice from the audience cut through the studio atmosphere with the authority and directness of someone who had lived through extraordinary challenges. "Mr. Pacino?" Both Al and Jimmy turned toward the sound. In the 4th row, slightly left of center, an older man in his 70s was standing among the seated audience members. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt and carried a white cane. His bearing was dignified, military straight, and there was something in his demeanor that immediately commanded respect. Most notably, his eyes had the unfocused quality of someone who could not see. "Yes, sir," Al responded immediately, his voice carrying the deep respect he had always shown for veterans and people who had overcome challenges. "What's your name?" "My name is Colonel William Hayes, retired," the man replied, his voice clear and strong, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I lost my sight in Vietnam, 1968. I've been blind for 56 years. "Colonel Hayes," Al repeated with obvious reverence. "Thank you for your service. What did you want to share?" Colonel Hayes took a measured breath, and suddenly the energy in the studio shifted dramatically. The lighthearted conversation about acting techniques and career highlights was about to become something much more profound, much more personal. "Mr. Pacino," the Colonel began, his voice gaining conviction with each word, "I've watched Scent of a Woman dozens of times over the past 32 years. Not because I'm a fan, though I am, but because you captured something about blindness that most people never understand." The studio fell silent. This wasn't just a fan sharing appreciation. This was someone who had lived the reality that Al had portrayed, speaking from decades of authentic experience. The way Colonel Slade moved through space, the way he used his other senses, the way he refused to let people treat him like he was helpless. Colonel Hayes continued, his voice carrying both admiration and deep recognition. "That wasn't just good acting, Mr. Pacino. That was someone who understood what it really means to be blind." Al sat completely still, clearly moved by the Colonel's words and understanding that this conversation was about to touch something deeply meaningful. "So, I have to ask you," Colonel Hayes said, his voice now carrying both curiosity and respect, "how did you capture blindness so perfectly? Because what you did in that performance, it felt real. It felt like you had lived it." The silence that followed was profound. This wasn't just about acting techniques. This was about the difference between performance and authentic understanding, between imagination and lived experience. Al stared at the Colonel for a long moment, clearly understanding that this conversation was about to touch something he had kept private for over 3 decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more personal, stripped of all performer's bravado. "Colonel Hayes," Al said softly, "what I'm about to tell you, I've never talked about publicly in 32 years. Without hesitation, without consulting producers or following any protocol, Al Pacino stood up from his chair and walked directly into the audience toward Colonel Hayes. "Sir," Al said as he reached the Colonel's row, "may I sit with you for a moment?" The Colonel nodded, and the surrounding audience members quietly made room. Al sat down beside him, both men now facing each other in this profound moment of connection. "To answer your question, Colonel," Al began, his voice now carrying the weight of decades of hidden truth, "I lived blindfolded for 2 months during my preparation for that role." The studio audience gasped audibly. This was clearly far beyond what anyone had expected to hear about method acting preparation. "Not just during rehearsals or on set," Al continued, his voice growing more intense with each revelation. "I lived my life blindfolded. I ate blindfolded. I slept blindfolded. I navigated my apartment blindfolded. For 8 weeks, I experienced the world the way Frank Slade experienced it." Jimmy had left his desk and was now standing at the edge of the stage, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "And you're asking how I captured blindness so perfectly?" Al said, looking directly at the Colonel, even though he knew the man couldn't see his expression. "Because I lived in that darkness, Colonel. I lived with that isolation, that frustration, that feeling of being cut off from the world you used to know." The emotion in his voice was palpable as decades of carefully guarded method acting secrets gave way to unexpected vulnerability. Those scenes where Slade gets angry, where he lashes out at people trying to help him. That wasn't scripted behavior, Colonel. That was me, after 6 weeks of bumping into furniture, of spilling food on myself, of feeling helpless and dependent on others for the first time in my life. Al reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of black fabric. "This is the blindfold I wore for those 2 months, he said, showing it to the Colonel and the cameras. "I kept it because those 8 weeks taught me something about acting, about empathy, that I never learned in any class or workshop." He placed the blindfold in Colonel Hayes' hands. "I want you to have this, Colonel, because you lived what I only pretended to live. You understand what Frank Slade was really fighting for, not just independence, but dignity." The studio was completely silent except for the soft sounds of people being moved to tears by this unexpected revelation. "But here's what I learned during those months, Colonel," Al continued, his voice now filled with hard-earned wisdom and deep respect. "Blindness doesn't make you helpless. It makes you develop strengths that sighted people never have to discover. Your hearing, your sense of touch, your memory, they become superhuman." The audience began to applaud, but Al held up his hand gently. "That hoo-ah that everyone remembers, that came from a moment during my preparation when I successfully made dinner for myself after 6 weeks of failures. It was my victory cry, my way of saying, I'm still here, I'm still capable, I'm still alive. Colonel Hayes was nodding knowingly, clearly understanding the profound truth in Al's words. And Colonel, Al continued, I want you to know that everything Frank Slade accomplished in that movie, the tango, the Ferrari ride, the way he stood up for what was right, that was inspired by veterans like you who refused to let their disabilities define their limitations. Jimmy, his voice thick with emotion, addressed both men. This is incredible. 32 years later, we're finally hearing the real story behind one of the greatest performances in cinema history. But Al wasn't finished. He began removing his black jacket. Colonel Hayes, he said, draping the jacket over the man's shoulders. This jacket has been with me through countless interviews where I've kept this truth private. Tonight, it goes home with someone who lived the reality I was trying to honor. Colonel Hayes, now wearing Al's expensive jacket, reached up and touched the fabric, his trained fingers reading the quality and craftsmanship even without sight. And Colonel, Al continued, I want you to know that every veteran who saw that movie and felt recognized, who felt like their struggles were being honored, that was the real purpose of that performance. Not the Oscar, not the acclaim, but the recognition of what you and others like you have overcome. He turned to address the cameras directly. To any veteran dealing with disabilities, to anyone who feels like society has written them off because they're different, you have strength that most people never develop. You have courage that most people never need. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't accomplish. The show ended differently that night. No standard closing monologue, no promotional segments. Just Al and Jimmy sitting with Colonel Hayes as the credits rolled. Three men connected by the understanding that sometimes the greatest performances come from the willingness to temporarily live someone else's reality with complete commitment. When the episode aired 2 weeks later, it became the most watched Tonight Show segment featuring Al Pacino in television history. The hashtag, Scent of a Woman Truth, trended globally as millions of viewers shared their own stories of overcoming disabilities and the importance of authentic representation. Colonel Hayes became an unexpected advocate for veteran disability rights and authentic representation in media. He always wore Al's jacket to speaking engagements and interviews. Al never spoke publicly about changing his approach to discussing his method acting techniques, but those close to him noticed something different. In subsequent interviews, he began acknowledging the personal costs of his immersive preparation more openly, admitting that some roles had required him to experience realities that were difficult to process. And every time someone quoted, "Who?" after that night, Al thought about Colonel Hayes and the moment he finally admitted that his Oscar-winning performance had come from temporarily living in darkness to better understand the light that people with disabilities bring to the world. Sometimes, the most powerful art comes not from imagination, but from the courage to experience someone else's truth with complete authenticity and respect.